All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on version control using Git and GitHub. I know some of you may probably be used to Git, so it's probably going to be a boring talk for you. But we have some people in the audience that have never used a version control tool before, so we're going to do a little bit of a talk on what it is. We're going to talk about Git. Hopefully, we're going to do a little bit of a walkthrough on how to install Git on your computer. And lastly, we will see how to make use of GitHub to host our repositories. Okay. But first of all, let's talk about version control. What is a version control system? Well, you probably won't believe me, but I'm pretty sure you use some kind of version or form of or way of dealing with version control on a daily basis. Right, for almost everything we do, we usually follow the same process over and over and over. So whether we're working on a document, on a design, or for us developers on code, we usually create the things that we're working on. We save them. Later on, we can come and edit them, and then we save again, right? We repeat the cycle over and over and over again. When you look at this picture, does this look familiar to you guys? Have you ever done something similar to this before? This is pretty common with designers specifically, where you start working on a design, you first have your new file there, you change something because you don't want to lose the change that you made on that initial file. You create a copy of that file, you make the change, and you name it something else, right? And as you can imagine, it goes on and on and on until the frustration gets there and you finally have what you think is the final version of your software. I'm pretty sure you've done this, whether with your documents or whatever, right? So this in itself is a version control system, right? Doing this, you're doing some kind of versioning already with your file. But you can only imagine that this is not going to be a sustainable thing to do when you start working on like complex project. If you think about the project that Thomas worked on earlier on, if you want to keep track of all the files that are part of that project, then it becomes kind of a nightmare, right? So in general, version control systems will provide clarity about when the changes are made, right? Why did we make the change in the first place? And what was the content of the changes that we made? So on a typical document lifecycle, you will first of all create a document. Then perhaps we change some text color, the color of the text on document, and maybe we fix some spelling mistakes, and we keep making changes to the document over time like that until we have, a final version to the project, right? But as I mentioned earlier on, doing this manually is going to be like a very painful thing to do, especially when you have a lot of files to deal with, right? But then you have ways to like automate this process in some capacity. But in addition to when you're working with version control on your files, on your file alone, that's fun. But when you start working on complex projects with bigger teams and stuff like that, it is important to have a more automated way of tracking changes of the files that you're working with. You need to somehow collaborate with your teammates. You need to be able to not only know who made the changes, but you need functionalities like reverting back, to any change and go back to a previous state, in your history, right? This is where a tool like Git comes into play. Right? So what is Git and what can we do with it? Well, Git is very good for, whether you're working collaboratively or as an individual in a project. But it also has some very important features like, distributed system versus a centralized repository for storing changes on your project. It is very fast in terms of tracking and like showing you the changes on your project. You can use it offline, right? So you don't need to have a remote server to like store your changes. So you can access the full history tree on your local machine. It is also very efficient at handling large project files. Okay. Was created in 2005 by Linus Torvald. Linus Torvald is the father of Linux, which is an operating system. And it basically came out as part of the Linux development community because they, as the project grew, they needed a way to like systematically track the changes over time of the project, right? See how the project has evolved, if need be, like revert back to some previous changes and so on and so forth. And so they decided to build Git as a way to sort of manage that. And the first project it was used on was, in fact, the Linux kernel to sort of like track all the changes on that project. The reason for calling Git was the definition of Git as per Linus Torvald is simply a cranky old man. So someone who's stupid or despicable or whatever, right? So he was referring to himself when he thought about this name because, you know, he wanted this thing so bad, and like he thought, yeah, this could be a very good name to give this project, right? So this is how the name came about. We have a couple other version control systems out there. Mercurial is one of them. Subversion, and many more version control systems are available for you to make use of. Now, Git over the past few years have become the like preferred version control system among the developer community in general. So for various reasons, of course, right? So that's why we are making use of it. Now, how do you get Git set up on your computer? If you're using Linux, you can add the repository for Git to your computer and just run this command and it will install it for you. On Windows, you can follow this link and they will have an installable package that you can download and just install that on your terminal, and what it will provide you is a set of executable that you can use to like track changes on your project. On macOS, you also have a downloadable link, but you can also make use of, if you're using a package manager like Homebrew, you can use Homebrew to install Git as well by running the command brew install Git. Yeah. So once that is installed, there are a couple of things that we need to do initially, right? Remember, we mentioned at the beginning that it is important when we are using a version control system, it is important for us to know who made the changes, right? So when you install Git, the first thing you have to do is, of course, tell it who you are, and the way you describe yourself or setting up your identity is by setting up your name. You need to provide your full name and your email address, right? And you can also do some extra configurations if you need to for your setup. Okay. Now, some key concepts that are quite important. We're gonna get back to this in a moment. Where if you guys want to, we can set that up together and like play around with some of the commands that we use with Git. But before we do that, we need to talk about some of the core concept of Git, essentially. The first one is a concept of snapshot. What a snapshot is essentially a record of all the files at a given point in time, right? So when you start your project and you want to track the changes in those projects, you create what's called snapshots of those files at that time, right? And the next concept is the concept of commit. Creating a commit is essentially saving the snapshot that you took of your files and then marking it with some sort of label or message to indicate what this change was all about, right? The next important concept that we need to talk about is the concept of repositories. What a repository is It is a collection of all the files and the history of all those files. Quite often we will use the shortened version of it, which is repo. So this is what developers make use of most of the time. You can host a repository locally on your machine, or you can have it on a remote server, right? Because in some cases you might want to have a backup of your files on a remote server in case maybe you lose your computer or something happens to it. Cloning repositories. So when you clone something, you're basically getting a copy of the repository from a remote server down to your computer, right? And this will only happen like probably once like if you get onto a project, in order for you to like get the code or the files from your teammate, you will have to clone it from a remote repository, right? And then it downloads those files onto your computer, and you have a copy of that repository as well locally. And the next time you want to get some updates from the remote repository, you will basically pull the changes. This is the concept of pulling. So pulling will allow you to download new commits that are not available yet on your local machine, but are available on the remote server down to your local. So you git pull to fetch those changes. When you make some changes locally and you want to share them with other people, you need to push your commit up to a remote repository, and then just like you pulled earlier on, they will be able to pull those changes as well from the same repository, right? And we also have a concept of branches, right? One of the good things about using a version control system like Git is when you're working on your file, you can easily make use of branches to sort of like experiment with some ideas, right? So one of the main branch that you will usually find on your repository is called master branch, and what the master branch is pretty much the representation of your files. That's like the stable version of your files. If we are in the context of a software, that's like the working version of your software, right? You can then create branches on which you're gonna do like extra commit to sort of like see whether or not you can, like, the changes that you make are not gonna break the software. Once you make those changes, if you're happy with them, you can later on merge them with the master branch and so on, right? So branches will allow you to do those kind of experiments without breaking your software. All right. There's another concept of head, which is like a reference to the most recent commit. Now, I think I've talked a lot about Git. Maybe it's time for us to do a little bit of a demo just to show you how you can make use of Git to track changes into your files, right? Is there anyone who wants to tag along with me, maybe? Or should I just go ahead and do it?
I've done this before, so I'm the one to tag along.
Well, I didn't ask you. There are more people in the room. Right. Okay, so let's see if we can do this. Right, I'm gonna pull my terminal. Okay. So what's gonna happen here? So the way you interact with Git is at least most of the time I interact with Git from my terminal. There are some graphical user interface that you can make use of, to play around with it. But yeah, let's create the directory here. But let's say I'm working on my website, for instance. So I'm gonna create a directory called website, and so let's go in that directory, and I gonna add a page there. Right, this is the beginning of my project, right? You can let me know if I need to make the text a little bit bigger. Perhaps I should.
It's okay.
Okay. Right, so we are just starting on this website, right? And we want to use Git to sort of like track the changes that we are making on it, right? The way we're going to do that is the first thing you need to do when you start on a project is you need to initialize a repository in that directory, right? The command that you need to run for that, this of course assumes that you went through, let's go back to the slides for a second. This assumes that you've installed Git, right? And that you have made this initial setup on your computer, okay? And then we're gonna play around with this. Okay, so once you install that, you should have a command on your terminal. And I'm gonna do git v, or rather git version. All right, so I have git install here, so I can make use of it to start tracking changes on this project. Right, so I just created my project. The first thing I need to do is initialize a repository on this project. What the repository will do is that it will track all the changes that I'm going to make over time on all the files in this project. Right. To create a repository, you type the command git init, right, and then you get this message that says that you've initialized an empty repository in this folder. Right. As I mentioned before, head is just to say this. It's just a reference to the last commit that we've made. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and just check. The next command that you often make use of is the status command. So git status will allow you to see what's the current state of the directory in which you're working on. And we can see from the output of this message that we are currently on the master branch. I haven't created any branch yet. And we have a single file that is currently not tracked. Now, what this means is that I have initiated a repository on Git, but Git is not like, and I only have one file in this project so far, right? But at this point in time, it's not tracking whatever change I'm going to make here. It's not going to be able to actually track those changes until I specifically tell it to start tracking it, right? So how do I tell it to track files? In order for it to start tracking the changes on the index file, I will have to add this file to what's called a staging area. To do that, we do git add and we specify the file name that we want to add. Okay. So in doing that, if I do git status now, you can see that instead of like the previous message that we had here, has changed to something else, right? So it now tells us that we have some changes that are ready to be committed, right? In order for me to, what I've just done now is I just created a snapshot of the changes that I'm about, a snapshot of my project right now, but I need to save that snapshot. And the way to do that is by creating a commit, right? So to create a commit, I'm going to do git commit. And in this context, I need to pass in a message that describes the changes that I just made. Now, I just created this project, so a message that will make sense here is start new project. Okay. Right. Now, as you may have noticed, I created this file and there's nothing in there. If I make some changes to this file, just open this in my editor. Right. When it loads, good. So I'm going to open this file here. Index. And I'm going to add some code to it. So let's do that. And the title, my awesome website. Right, this is a very fancy website that I just created. Now I want to create a snapshot. I'm happy with the changes that I just made now. I need to now make a snapshot of these changes so that later on I can depending on my needs, revert back to a certain state in my project. Now, if I head back to my terminal and I do a git status, we will see that because we are tracking, because we initially added index into our version control system, Git is now aware of all the changes. Whenever we make some changes to this file, it will be aware of those changes. And when we do a git status, it knows that we just modified this file. Okay? And so I can simply, if I'm happy with this change, I can just add index file again, right? When I add this, I'm creating a snapshot, and I need to save that snapshot. And for this message, I can say basic web page, right? Now, something that's interesting with this is because I just created a couple of commits now, I can ask Git for sort of like the history of all the changes that I've made on this file, right? If I issue the log command, you can see that on at this day, on Saturday, December 2nd, at this time, I made this commit, and the title for this commit was Start New Project. And then later after that, I made another commit, and we can see the author of the commit and his email address, right? Remember, it is important with the version control system to know who made the change when those changes were made, right? But also, it is important to know what those changes were actually, right? So if I go back to this one, and maybe let's say I add this, right? I've just modified my title a little bit. If I then add the file again, and I can create a new commit to say update site title. Right, so if I do, Git will allow me to see, let's do a git log for a moment. So we see those 3 commits now. If I want to see what was the difference between this commit here and the previous one, all I need to do is, I'm going to copy this. So these numbers, this series of numbers of letter here is just an ID that Git has attached to every commit that we make, on our repository, and then we can use those ID to sort of like ask for differences between each commit, right? So I'm gonna provide us with a command called diff for differences. So I want to see the difference between the current commit, the last commit that I made, and this one here. Okay, so when I do this, I can see that before this last commit, this is what I had as my title, right? What is marked in red here is what was the state of this file at this commit hash here, right? And then after that, I made this change here, and the change is highlighted in green. Okay, so this is the third functionality that Git will provide you, like the ability to see what changes you actually made between every commit as you progress. Okay, so what I just showed you right now is some of the basic, commands that we make use of on a daily basis to track changes on projects. And now the one thing that I'm going to move to, let's see if I covered all the. Okay, so we saw how to initialize a repository. We saw how to check the status of our repository. We were able to add files, right, that we wanted to add to a snapshot. We created commit. We could see the history, and we could see the difference of all between all the commits. Now, let's say, for instance, I want to share my code with Thomas, who's currently in Sweden, right? How do I go about doing that? In the past, before version control system, what was very common among developers was that you would, compress your files into a zip document and then email them to someone, right? And in some instances, that file is so big that you can't even attach it to your email, right? Now, I mentioned earlier on the concept of remote servers, right? You have the possibility to push your repositories to an external server and grant access to people for that server. Now, setting up server is not a common thing. Like, not everyone can set up servers and install the right software that we need to in order to, like, store Git repositories on, right? This is where GitHub comes into play. What GitHub allows you to do is basically provide you with a platform where once you've created your account, right, you can pretty much create repositories on their system. They set up all the servers that you need. You don't need to worry about the server infrastructure and all that. All you need to do is essentially visit their website, create an account there, and you're good to go, right? So I'm going to quickly log into my account now and show you how I can go about sharing this project now with Thomas. So, hello?
Am I needed for anything?
Yeah, sure, you can. So I'm gonna go to GitHub now with me. And so once you have an account there, you will have a page that looks like this. So this is pretty much a listing of all the projects that I've been involved with, right? So we're gonna go ahead and create a new repository here because this is what I want to share this code with Thomas. And I'm gonna call this MLH Git demo, right? So you give your repository a name. You can give it a description. Now you have two types of repository. A public repository is accessible to anyone, so meaning anyone with a link to this repository will be able to download this project. Private are obviously closed, so only the people you give access to will be able to see that. And so I'm gonna create this repository here. What it's gonna do is it's gonna create an empty repository on GitHub with no code, and it's gonna give me instructions to basically push my local repository to GitHub. Okay. So what I'm gonna do, when it creates a repository for you, it gives you a link to that repository, right? So I'm gonna copy this link here, and I'm gonna add the server on my local machine and basically tell Git that, hey, I'm gonna want you from now on to, like, whenever I want to push code outside, push it to the server at this location. Okay. So we head back to our terminal. Now the command to connect to a remote repository is git remote. So I'm gonna add a repository. I'm gonna call this origin. Now you can add multiple remote location for your code, but we're gonna do just one now. And once I do this, I'm gonna use the push command to push this code to my master branch, right? So I'm saying here, Git, please push this code that I have on my local machine to the remote server called origin and to the branch master. When I do this, it uploads all the files, including the Git repository that I have locally on the machine, to GitHub servers, right? Now, when I switch over to GitHub, if I refresh this page, what we had as an empty repository now is going to have the content of my project, right? Now, in order for Thomas to get access to this code, all I need to do now is share this link with him. And I'm going to switch to HTTPS, right? So now my email becomes just about sending him that link and not trying to attach a very large file to him. And what he's going to do next is pretty much clone that repository down on his computer, and just like that, he has access to the code that I just made. And he can make some changes to that repository and push them back, and like within a matter of like few seconds or minutes, you get access. I can get access to the code as well.
Let's see if we can do that.
Right.
All right. All right. So let me just Can I go over to no? No? All right. Perhaps let's keep this thing like this or not. We just switch. There we go. Let's remove Raul for a second, or not, but let's just go to my terminal.
Are you going to share your screen?
Please share your screen.
I will share my screen in a second. I'm just going to move my thing here. And here we are. Where are we? There we are. So let's go. Let's share that screen. And here we are. Oh, we see the tunnel. Okay, forget about the tunnel. All right, so here I am on my terminal. Forget about the background tunnel. Let's just get rid of that. And I'm going to go into Slack because Raul slacked me that repository. So I'm just going to find my cursor, of course. No cursor. Where am I? Where's my cursor? There you go.
We see your cursor.
Okay, so yeah, I can see that. Okay, so what I need to do now is, of course, just do a Git Clone Command that Raul was talking about earlier, and I'm going to clone this thing like this, right?
Yep.
And we are cloning that down to the MLH demo folder, so I can just CD into that. And if I now do ls, I can see that we have an index.html file. So in a matter of seconds, I have his code available on my computer. I'm going to pop it open in Atom just to see if we can. Again, we are here, right? And I can see here that this is the latest version of his code. And I'm just going to create some content. And I say that Git is awesome. And I can do some other stuff, collaborating on code. It's fun, right? And something like that, right? And yeah, whatever. And here if I go to git diff, sorry, I can see my changes directly before I even committed, right? I can see those changes in green. I didn't delete anything from his code, so I don't see any red stuff in my git diff command. But I can do git add index HTML and then git commit message and just say adds content to index HTML, for instance. ML adds content to index HTML. And what I can do now, hopefully, if Raul has added me as a collaborator, I can do.
Yeah, I don't think you will be able to do that, but I can fix that up quickly.
If you do that real quickly, then I can push that up to you. And I get an email or something, right?
Yeah, you will get an invitation in your email to basically have access to my repository.
Right.
Find you.
Right. So let's just send that off now. I didn't get.
Send you the invitation link, and then you can just go there without going.
Okay. Oh, here we are. So I just got this email from Raul that he has invited me to collaborate with him on this little project. So I'm just going to view this invitation, and I'm going to accept this invitation. And now what I can do something like that. I can do push origin master, which is a command that will push up my changes to his repository. And if I just do this now, obviously I have to type in my password. And now I'm pushing stuff up to his repo. And if we come here now and reload this page, we can see that there are 4 commits in this code. And if we check out the code on the that is stored on GitHub, it reflects my changes as well, right? So it's a collaboration that has happened between him and me. And I guess we can switch back to your
right.
Your,
okay.
Oh.
So if I want to get the changes that Thomas just made now, all I need to do is issue a Git Clone Command, right? Then what will happen now is it will download those changes onto my computer, right? And we can see that we can see an indication here of, like, you know, the changes that Thomas made. He added 2 lines and probably removed another one, right? So if I switch back to my text editor, you can see I have the code that Thomas did, right? Now, what we just did now is a very simplified demonstration of, you know, how you can make use of Git. First of all, to track changes on your project, but also to collaborate with your team members on a specific project, right? And like this is some of, you know, one of the very important tools like a developer can have nowadays. I remember back when I was still in school, I used to work on a whole lot of projects, and a few years later on, I wanted to show some of my projects to, you know, friends. But the problem with that is that I had those projects stored on a hard drive that had crashed a while back, so I couldn't find the project. Now, if I had a tool like Git combined with GitHub, I could have easily retrieved a backup of that project from those servers, right? No stress. So in addition to collaboration and, like, you know, version control, you also can, you know, use the benefits of backing up your project. Now, there are some advanced topics that you can use when it comes to using version control. We didn't cover the concept of branching in this talk. I really invite you to check it out. And there are some, like, even, you know, advanced topics, right? But this is where we're going to stop for now. The idea for this was to give you a brief overview of, slides. Give you a brief overview of what version control is, how you can set it up for your computer, and create an account on GitHub to share your code with some of your colleagues, right? And that's about it for me. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope this was informative for you guys.
Thanks, guys.